Hello Finxters and welcome to a new Pandas tutorial. In this tutorial we will learn about the Pandas meld function, which turns a wide data frame into a long data frame. So this function unpivots selected columns of the data frame, so these columns basically get turned into rows. And we will see how that works with an introductory example. First of all, we import the Pandas library. Then we create a Pandas data frame that contains information about students. And the outputted data frame looks like this. For each student, we have the name, we have the student's major and the student's age. And now we apply the Pandas meld function. Looks like this, pd.meld, and first of all, we apply df, which is the data frame that we just created. And now we apply the ID vars parameter, first of all. And this parameter basically expects a list of the columns that we use as the identifier variables. So these are the columns that remain unchanged. And we choose the student column for this. And we apply the value vars parameter, which expects a list of the columns that are going to be unpivoted. And for this purpose, we use the major column. And if we execute that, we get a new data frame. And this is a modified data frame. And the student column, as we can see, remains the same as before. But now we neither have a major column nor an age column, but instead we have two new columns which are named variable and value. And the variable columns elements all say major because that's the column that we transformed into row values. And the value column contains the respective major value for each student. So for example, the first row says Alice majors in biology, and yeah, basically the major thing got turned into a row. And compared to the initial data frame, we see that the age column is now completely missing, and that's because we did not incorporate it into the meld function. And all the columns that we do not include in the meld function are basically dropped. But now we will see in a slightly modified version of the function that we can actually apply multiple columns to the value vars parameter, because the value vars parameter expects a list of columns. And so it doesn't have to be only one column, we can apply multiple columns here. And for this we will copy this line, and to the major column we add the age column. So now we have basically two columns that are going to be unpivoted. And if we execute that, we can now see that the new data frame has twice as many rows as before. That's because the variable column now contains two unpivoted columns, the major column and the age column. And thus the value column now contains values for both unpivoted columns. And now we also see that the identifier variable, which is the student column, now holds every student's name 2 times. That's because for each student we now have a major and an age, which is stored in 2 separate rows, since the major column and the age column were both unpivoted. For example, Alice majors in biology, and Alice is 21 years old. These two information rows are now, as I said, in 2 separate rows, but before it was stored in 1 row because we unpivoted 2 columns. And as we can see, the new data frame has indexes that range from 0 to 5, so 6 rows in total. but the original data frame only had 3 rows from 0 to 2, so indexes from 0 to 2. And maybe we want to keep track of the original indexes, so keep track of the size of the original data frame. And we can achieve that by applying the ignore index parameter. Again, we copy this made function here, and all we change is that we say we want to ignore the index, or we set the ignore index parameter to false, which keeps the original indexes basically. And if we execute that, we can see that now we have not indexes ranging from 0 to 5, but indexes reaching from 0 to 2, but 2 times. And for example, both Alice rows now have the index 0, because in the original data frame, the Alice rows index was 0 as well, whereas in the data frame before, the first Alice rows index was set to 0, and the second Alice rows index was set to 3. And now we have basically, this looks more like the original data frame. Which approach we use depends on basically, how we want the new data frame to look like, and if we want to keep track of the original size or not. It just depends a little bit on the use case. So we've already seen that we can unpivot multiple columns by applying multiple column names to the value vars parameter. But the ID vars parameter also expects a list of columns, so we can apply multiple columns here too. So we can apply multiple columns that remain unchanged. And we do it like this. Now we not only apply the student column, but also the major, for example. And for the value vars parameter, so the rows that are unpivoted, we choose the H column. And as we can see, we now have, again, only 3 rows, because we only have one unpivoted column, namely the H column. So we can see it's stored in the variable and value column. And we have the 2 columns that remain unchanged, the student and the major column. And but as we can see, always the unpivoted columns got called variable and value in the new data frames. These names can be a little bit confusing because in some data frames it might not be obvious what these columns contain. But luckily we can name these columns by applying the 2 parameters var name and value name. And we can again copy this line, paste it here, and now we will name these columns by applying the parameters. For var name, we apply H column as the name or as the label. And for value name, which is the value column, we say H values. And if we execute that, we can see that compared to the data frame we had before, now these the variable and value column are labeled differently, which makes it a bit easier to understand what's contained in them. In this case, it's very straightforward and easy to name because we only had one unpivoted column, the H column. But if we have multiple unpivoted columns, the naming process might not be that straightforward, and we have to find comprehensible labels. So we will have a look at a meld function from before, where we had multiple unpivoted columns. Again, for the columns that remain unchanged, we choose student. And for the unpivoted columns, we choose, we choose major and age. And now we have to find labels for this data frame, because as we can see, this is the one that we've seen in the previous section, and now the variable column contains the entries major and age. So we have to find labels that's basically fits to both unpivoted columns. For example, we could name this variable column major/age column. Maybe we could name the value name or the value column major/age values. And now we have labels that represent what these columns contain. So yeah, we have to find just comprehensible names that really state, okay, this is contained in this column. So it's very critical to label these columns properly so we know what they contain. And yeah, that was the tutorial. We have learned how to use the meld function and how to apply its various parameters. We saw how we can unpivot one or more columns and how to handle indexes, how to set multiple identifier columns, and how to label the newly created columns. And yeah, all in all, the meld function allows us to unpivot our data frames in several ways. And yeah, that was the tutorial. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned something, and I see you in the next one.